Sure. Happy holiday, everybody. How's it going? See, we're ready to go. Did I have a bad angle? You were seeing my double chin, weren't you? But we're good now. Hey, did Mr. Panther happen to make it? Oh, okay. I wonder if are we able to have Mr. Panther pray to open us up? Oh, we won't. I'm sorry. Okay, that sounds good. Wadotodach, OCO, Nugad, Faith Phillips, Dawado, Locust Grove, Chinela. And it was really important for me to ask Mr. Panther to come today because um, I'm honored, absolutely honored to be speaking in the New Language Center. But I'm still learning. I don't know if you could even say I'm a 2 year old when it comes to the language. I grew up in Proctor in a Cherokee family, and I would always hear the words that we're all familiar with, chooch and gidla. And but I never learned the language, and the reason for that is because my great great grandfather was a preacher at Old Green, and he never spoke a word of English. But his daughter, who was my great grandmother, Pearl Elsie Shell, she wasn't allowed to attend his church, and in fact, she was sent to one of the boarding schools. And I was fortunate enough to know her as I was growing up, and she never spoke Cherokee, but she always had the Cherokee Old Testament translation. Um, she always had that next to her chair, and it really didn't strike me what how much we had lost in the loss of our language until I was older. I didn't really understand, and so Mr. Panther has really been instrumental in helping me understand um, what was lost from my family I guess 4 generations ago, and help me to understand the importance of getting it back. And I'll talk more about that later when we talk about what my students achieved. But what little I have learned, I started studying the language in the lockdown. And what when I did start learning the language, I was learning with Ed Fields. And I was just struck. I was just taken away, because when you're teaching the language, you're teaching through storytelling, which is very powerful. And so not only was I starting to learn the language that we were given to speak to our creator with, I was also starting to understand the culture that I had that had that we had lost, that had been taken away. And it was just so powerful and beautiful, and as a writer, so inspirational as well. Because Ed Fields always says, um, English and Cherokee are like apples and oranges. There's no comparison, and it's true because we were talking about just the word apple, and so in English it's just you just have a word that's symbolic, apple, but in Cherokee there it's like this description of this delicious thing that hangs in a tree, and that's incredibly appealing as a creative, as a person who is a writer. And so in a way I feel like I'm taking back a lot of the things that I've lost, and I can't tell you how exciting it is to me when I see my niece and nephew, who are, I think they're 7 and 9, and they're coming to me and they've been taught in elementary school at Stillwell. They're being taught the language, and it's very powerful. I think when you start to reverse the harmful effects of taking away a culture and a language, and I'm just really honored and proud to be here. And I'm first off, I should probably apologize to everyone, and especially to my students who were supposed to come today and speak about their poetry. I had a positive exposure to COVID, and I thought I was going to be fine. I'd been testing and everything, and then I woke up at 2:30 this morning, and I had fever and chills, and I knew that it would be very immoral actually for me to show up. So I'm doing okay, but I just am really sorry for anybody who made the trip out there that didn't get the message. And I apologize to Roy. I know that was probably not an exciting thing to wake up to this morning, but happy holiday. I told you guys in my post that we were going to celebrate today. And even though I'm a little bit under the weather, I still want us to celebrate. I want us to celebrate the progress that the nation is making. I want to celebrate the reclamation of our stories. I was so excited by the State of the Union yesterday when the chief talked about repatriating our artifacts and also our loved ones who have been in museums. Because one of the things that I taught my students in our classes is that if you don't tell your own story, someone else will, and they'll always get it wrong. And that, I think Jeremy Charles is going to touch on that later today too. Our The way the Cherokee people have been portrayed traditionally in film and stories, I don't think has been accurate. In fact, you could even say it's been harmful. And so for us to take our stories back and to begin to tell those stories ourselves, that's going to give the world a different view of who we are and humanize ourselves. Because if you're able to point at someone as the other, it's very easy to treat them like they are not a human being. And it's really important that we stand up for our children, for our generations that are coming ahead of us, and not to mention the fact that the people who came before us sacrificed so much for us to even be here. And so it's our responsibility to make sure that we honor that and pass on the beautiful culture that is being Cherokee to the generations that are coming ahead. I have I was just thinking about the holiday. I think the last time I came to the holiday with my books, I had just started selling books. And so I did this crazy thing. I left law practice to write books. and everybody was like, "You're gonna do what?" And they were right. It was crazy. But I moved back to the Cherokee Nation to write my books because I had left when I graduated high school and went to law school at OU. And I was just thinking this morning about setting up my booth, and this couple from Maine stopped by, and they had, these really funny East Coast accents, and they were like, "Park the car. Where can I get some Cherokee food?" They wanted like authentic Cherokee food, and I was like, "Did you try Del Rancho?" um, because pretty much every Cherokee I know eats at Del Rancho. By the way, just put in a little plug for them. They are having a chicken biscuit sale, y'all. So I wish I could go with you this morning after the presentation, but I think I'm going to have to be holed up for a while. Um, so one of the Okie Noir, which is what I call my style of writing. And Okie Noir is inspired by this place where we live, which I love so much. I think that it has a huge part of why I am interested in writing and creating worlds, because growing up in Adair County, I don't know that there's a better place for a little kid to grow up, honestly. I would just take off and I would by myself just walk through the woods along the streams. I had this wild imagination, and I had secret places, and I would spend the summers in the creek, and it was just beautiful. But also, I read all the time. I had my nose in a book all the time. But I didn't really think that being a writer was an actual occupation. That, it seemed like the same as like saying I'm going to be an astronaut. Like, what are the chances? To me, that wasn't an option. But I loved reading and writing. And Okie Noir just kind of expresses how I feel. Like it's a beauty of the natural beauty, but also the trauma that our people have endured, um, and our resilience and the grief and the joy of being here. All of that melds together in my style of writing, because I want people I want to do my best to help people understand. Uh-huh. Sorry, did I miss somebody? Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought I heard somebody say something. Um, but I would, in my writing, I want people to understand what it feels like to really love this land where we live, and to be able to make a living off the land. I mean, I grew up, we would go to the river and set a trot line and sit around the campfire and tell stories. And I think that is what lit my creative fires. But I also felt like there wasn't a lot of opportunity, and I really felt like I want to go and make a success for myself, whatever that looks like, so I can take care of my family. Um, and so to me, that meant I needed to go get a law degree and or go to college. So I went off to college, and I had actually told, by the way, my some of you might remember my grandfather was Jigs Phillips. He was a councilman under the Man Killer administration. And that's another reason why I'm so honored to be asked to speak here at the New Language School, because that was really his big platform, as he pushed education of Cherokees. That was his most important um, platform as a councilman and a servant to the Adair County people. But I remember I was sitting around the breakfast table with him, and I think I was a senior in high school, and I was like, I'm busting out of here. As soon as I get a chance, I'm busting out of here. Even though I loved the place, I was ready, to see the world. And he just had this funny look on his face, like he knew something I didn't know. And today, I think what that look was, I think he always knew that I would come back home, even though I really didn't know. Um, so I went and got my law degree, practiced corporate law, and I was absolutely miserable. And I was writing every chance I got. And an opportunity came up where the our company was bought by a much larger corporation, and I really didn't like the way they treated the people. And so I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go move back home, mooch off of my family, and write my first book. And in my mind, because I can be delusional, I thought it'll be 2 years before I make it, and it'll be a sacrifice, but it'll be fine. So I moved back home. I did indeed mooch off of my family while I was finishing up my first novel, which is probably the quintessential Okinawa novel. It's called Ezekiel's Wheels. Little plug. And it's a supernatural thriller, kind of scary. But that was my dream, is I thought I want to be a literary fiction writer. I want to write love letters to the Cherokee Nation. I want people to understand the beauty and the draw of this place, and why we want to come, why there is a homecoming, why everybody wants to come back home, and our roots in this place. And so it didn't sell very many copies. And that was okay though, because I thought, I did what I said I was going to do. And then I started to work on my second book, and it was a memoir. And then the third book is a true crime novel, which I never wanted to write true crime. That was never my intention. But a woman that I went to law school with, she had prosecuted the Walika murders, and we met up together by chance, like 10 years after we graduated law school. And she told me the story of what happened in Walika in 2008, on the Muskogee Creek Nation. And as soon as she told me that story, we were actually, like I had done when I was a kid, we were actually sitting around a campfire by the river when she was telling me the story. And I said, oh, you're right. That is absolutely a book, because the story was so wild. It was really beyond my imagination. And so I wrote that book with the intention that I was going to go right back to writing fiction after that. And lo and behold, the true crime, the genre that I wasn't interested in at all, was by far my most successful book. That was when my career finally started taking off, after, I think that was maybe 6 years of writing. And I was excited. I'd sacrificed a lot and put in a lot of work. And then the principal from Stillwell High School sent me a message and said, hey, we need an English teacher at Stillwell High School. And I immediately just said no. And the reason why is just because I'm from a family of educators. All of my family, they're all public servants. They're either in the health field or they're teachers. And I know what the life of a teacher in Oklahoma looks like. It's definitely the hardest job I've ever done. Because if you do it right, you are carrying all of these souls with you. You don't leave them when you leave the school. You take them home with you, and I think it's just the most important job. Excuse me. It's the most important job that we can have, and I'm sure Mr. Panther can attest to that too. So I said absolutely not, because I was too selfish. I had just started making it as an author, and I was like, no way am I going to go be a public school teacher. And then I asked I have a spiritual advisor. You guys might know him, the Rev out of Adair County, BJ Latta. Sent him a message. I had a few other friends that I consider very close, for advice. And it was unanimous. They all said, you absolutely have to go teach at Stillwell, because Stillwell's where I graduated from in 1996. And I prayed about it, and I thought, maybe there's a writer there. Maybe, I could go and show kids because Stillwell's 80% Cherokee. Maybe somebody could look at me and say, hey, I can be an author. I can be a creative. I can do my art. I can express my passion. And so I thought, okay, I'll give it a year. And excuse me, I'll give it a year. And after that, I'm out. So I showed up at Stillwell And of course, I've been gone for a long time. So none of the kids knew who I was. They really did. They were just like this old lady. They didn't care that I had written books. They were very suspicious. One of them actually said, "Why would a lawyer come and teach English?" And so we got off to a rocky start. But then something changed. And I think what changed was that I shared a vulnerable story about myself, about growing up in Adair County. I read them a story that was kind of emotional and embarrassing. Like you wouldn't expect your teacher to share a story like that with you. And that was, I really think, the turning point when they felt like, okay, she's going to be honest with us, so we're going to be honest with her. And so they really started opening up with their writing and being vulnerable. And I know we're supposed to be talking about writing and poetry here, and I'll get to some poetry here in a minute, but um, it's really, if you're a writer, the act of being vulnerable is really important, because that's the moment when other human beings see that, oh, okay, I'm not by myself. There is someone else who's suffering. And that's one of the most important things we can do as human beings, I think, is to speak kindness, and speak life over people, because I absolutely believe in the power of words. Um, and you can speak life into someone. I've seen it. I've actually witnessed it myself, of somebody who's just been downtrodden, and you see what that person's gift is, because I believe everyone has a gift. And maybe they haven't realized it yet, or they've been so beaten down by life that they don't understand that they're a divine, beautiful, spiritual being with amazing gifts that they were given to do their work here on earth while we're here. Um, and when you speak life into a person, it's an amazing transformation. You can see them, you can see a light come on. And I saw that happen so many times in my students. But my students had, some of my students had a rough time, a rough go of it. A lot of them had lost parents, that to car crashes and substance, and they were seniors, and a lot of them were raising their siblings, and um, they were having a rough time. And the Washington Post had written an article about Stillwell. It said, "The strawberry capital of the world is the death capital of the United States." And everybody in Adair County that I knew of was really upset by this, because how are you going to be in, I don't know where the Washington Post is, I guess in Washington. How are you going to be out there and maybe come to Stillwell for 1 or 2 days and say that we live in the death capital? Um, and so I asked the students, I was like, is this the death capital, or is this true? And they were adamant, absolutely not. And they decided that they wanted to answer the Washington Post in a podcast for the National Public Radio Student Podcast Challenge. And so what they did was they broke up into teams, and they took that article that called Stillwell the death capital, and they broke it up into categories of what the reasons that the Washington Post used to say that we lived in the death capital. And it included environmental, water issues, poverty, addiction, access to healthcare, all of the things that accompany generational trauma. And the students decided they were going to start researching and also engaging our public servants in a civil manner to get information, to find out, why are people writing this about us? Do we have these issues, in fact, and what can we do to address them? To talk, because I strongly believe, and I told the students, I think if you've got an issue, you got a problem, you're not going to be able to fix it unless you talk about it. So these students, they went crazy. They went to work. They sat down with the mayor, with Mayor Wright. They sat down with the chief of police. They talked to a substance abuse counselor. They interviewed their congressional representative. And it was just this really powerful coalition. We made like a little family in that classroom of people who were damaged, who had experienced trauma, who had been hurt, and we just started healing each other, but with a common goal, but also with an interest in serving our little brothers and sisters and making sure that we could provide maybe a better life than what we had growing up. And so they worked really hard, and right before spring break, we were right on the cusp of the deadline, and they asked if we could come in on the weekend to work on the podcast. Now, I live in Locust Grove. I'm teaching in Stillwell, but they were so passionate that I couldn't say no. So I was driving to Stillwell on the weekend to help them finish up the podcast and to make sure that, they had adult supervision. And so they finished it up. We sent it off to NPR. They used my personal cell phone to record their story. And Mr. Panther actually started the podcast by speaking in Cherokee, we live at the end of the Trail of Tears. And so in that podcast, which is called Strawberries in the Death Capital, still up there if you want to take a listen to it. They talked about various issues, and a substance abuse counselor came on, and he said, when you have your culture ripped out by the roots, like what happened with the removal, you might not even know what's missing. You don't even know, and you're trying to fill that hole with something. And most of the time it's something that is not healing, something that's not good for your soul. It's not good for your body. And a lot of times you can be angry at what's happened, and I'm angry about what's happened in my county, and to my people. But what anger can be righteous, and it's also energy. So do you use that energy to hurt yourself, or do you use that energy to turn it around and start to address the things that have made you angry or upset you or hurt your family? And so that's what the students did in this podcast, and they spoke very powerfully. They weren't bitter. I say angry, but they weren't angry. They were just adamant. Not only these are the issues that we're calling out, but also here are some solutions. And they ended up debunking the Washington Post, finding that the statistics had been flawed. And not only that, so it was just incredible. Regardless of what the outcome for the podcast contest, they just dominated. It was like a beautiful thing to witness. I was blown away by their work and their passion. And then COVID hit, and we didn't know we weren't coming back after spring break. So we went to spring break and we didn't get to come back. And my kids were devastated. It was their senior year. They weren't going to get to walk for graduation. And they reminded me that they were born in 2001, the year of 9/11. And that they just felt like, we're just born, we're cursed. And of course I couldn't accept that. I said, no, we're not cursed. We have the power to make change, and you've already done that. And so I was sad for them. And then I got this email from NPR, and it said that the students had made the finalists. They were finalists for the NPR podcast challenge. Oh my gosh, I only have 10 minutes left. Sorry guys, I've been yapping so much. So they did that, and they competed against this school that was in New York City, called the New York Academy for Marketing and Media. And they had all of these really, expensive technological tools. But our students, they stood shoulder to shoulder with those students that had all those resources because of their powerful storytelling. And so that's what I keep emphasizing in all of my storytelling endeavors and in my teaching, is that you're very powerful. Your voice is very powerful. Even if you don't believe that you're a great writer, writing can be therapy. And so I'm going to just read a poem that one of the students wrote. I had shown them a poem called A Negro Speaks of Rivers. And so one of my students wrote, modeled after that poem, which is very powerful. And she wrote, a person speaks of rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers clear as ice and faster than the horses of the field. My mind has grown long like the rivers. I swam in the Illinois when it was hot. I jumped near Right Hole and it splashed. I looked upon Right Hole and smiled. I heard the splash of the water in the sky. I've seen its sand turn brown in the day. I've known rivers, rapid and strong rivers. My wisdom has grown strong like the river. And I just got chills reading that because, and that's as far as advice on writing poetry. And I apologize for anybody who came to like get instruction on poetry writing because I'm afraid I'm really not that qualified. But what I would recommend if you're interested in writing poetry, poetry is distilled. I write a lot of narrative, but poetry is so distilled, every word matters. And so I would suggest, like this student who wrote this beautiful poem about the rivers, the creeks and the rivers around here, I would suggest studying a poem like The Negro Speaks of Rivers and other really classic poems, and you can just plug your own experience into that form. And then after you practiced writing in that style, you can start to break out and get your own style. That is how I taught poetry writing with my students is don't be afraid to be vulnerable. And the more vulnerable you are in your writing, the more you're going to connect with other human beings and help them understand that they're not alone, and that they're a human being deserving of dignity, being treated with dignity, which is how I believe every human being is deserving. I have so much more to tell you, but there's only 6 minutes, so I'm going to kind of try to hit the highlights. But one of the most important things I wanted to tell you is that after the students won the National Podcast Challenge, I called in all of these different entities outside of the Cherokee Nation, like Chicago was asking for their poetry, New York, all of these different places. And I said, we need a place in Stillwell in Adair County where we can showcase the power of the storytelling that these students naturally have. And not just the writing, but also the podcasting, the art. We have the most incredible artists. And so I called together a lot of leaders in the community, and I said, we need to create a place to showcase this. So these people who are taking our art out and displaying it in these big cities, they can come here. And from now on, we can tell people who we are. We don't need anybody else to tell us we're the death capital or tell us. We'll tell you who we are, and we'll tell our story. And to do that, I felt like we needed a place in Adair County. So I started this cultural district. It's called Beyond the Trail Cultural District. I started it with a number of other people in the Adair County community who we have a board. And our goal ultimately is to have a brick and mortar space to house all of this beautiful art and the poetry and and have a podcast studio for the people of Adair County, so that we can tell our own stories. And actually, we started it 2 years ago. We're still working on getting the fundraiser started up. But one thing that I can say I'm incredibly proud of is that we hosted our first Indigenous Day celebration in Adair County last year. And one of my hopes was that after the pandemic, everybody had been kind of scattered and divided. And my hope was that we could bring families and people and just our community, not just Cherokees, because we all live side by side, and bring us all together again in the town square and just celebrate who we are, because we are where we live is beautiful. Our people are beautiful. They're, the kindest people in the world. And so that was really exciting. The chief showed up, and we had Cherokee treasures perform, demonstrating their traditional arts. And it was, for me to look around and to see everything that had been accomplished by the community and by these students taking back their story. It was probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. And I'll never forget it. After that, Mr. Panther had worked with my creative writing students to learn poetry in the Cherokee language. And they got selected for Native Truths at the Chicago Field Museum. And we got to go, Mr. Panther, I think it's his brother Elmer, and Jim F. Houston, Tyler Sawney, Reagan Hargis. We all loaded up, and our bus driver, Jeff Carson, and their families, and we went to the Chicago Field Museum, and we had a huge celebration because there were our kids speaking the language for Chicago and telling them who we are. And at one point, Tyler's family, Tyler Sawney's family, and Mr. Panther and Elmer all sang in Cherokee in this rotunda, and there was just this crowd all around. And that was a moment for me too. And I can't thank Mr. Panther enough, because he's really, as that gentleman had said, that when you get your roots ripped out, there's a hole there. And Mr. Panther has been doing the really hard work. As we all know, this is generational work. And it's a coalition building, and it's gonna take longer than our lives to repair all the damage that's been done. But I'm really excited that we're doing it. I look around, we're getting substance abuse treatment center in Adair County. We're getting domestic violence shelters, and we're starting to heal ourselves, which, as I think I said earlier, but this is a quote from Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior. She said that the solutions have to be tribally driven. And that's absolutely right. I believe that wholeheartedly. And that's why we're all here working together. And I think a really important part of that begins there at the Durbin Feeling Language Center. And I'm just honored and humbled. And I thank you all so much for putting up with my 45 minutes of rambling. But it was really special to be here. And I thank you so much. Donadago Honey. I can talk about the other what we did when we came back after the first year. If you guys if you guys want to listen again. Okay, thank you. Oh, no problem. It's my fault. All right, see you in a minute. Ready to go? I'm ready. Oh, okay, okay. Sorry. Well, so I'll just start back with, and I could probably yap about this for 2 hours, so I promise I won't keep you guys much longer. But there's a second part to this story, as if the first part wasn't bizarre enough. But so because I wasn't able to fulfill my promise, I promised I would teach for a year, and because of COVID, I wasn't able to finish. I felt like I hadn't done what I told Stillwell schools I would do. I hadn't fulfilled my obligation. So I agreed to come back for one more year. Well, after the powerful impact of that first podcast hit the Stillwell community, the students were just ready to rock and roll. They showed up on the first day. When are we going to start recording our podcasts? And they were so excited about it that I I let them go break off into different groups. The first podcast had been on one topic, but they wanted to find their classmate. And that's one thing that I really want to emphasize about our students is, people say a lot about this generation, but I feel like if you don't understand that they're very interested in justice, I'm afraid maybe you're not paying close enough attention, because what I saw in my students was an incredibly strong sense of justice and right and wrong. They were very passionate about it. And they had um, one of their classmates go missing. Michael McDougal, he's still missing now. No one's been able to find him. They wanted to do a podcast to research and investigate what had happened. And NPR had actually called them investigative reporters. And they really took that seriously. Like, yes, we are investigative reporters. And yes, we will do work to serve our community if we can. Well, I talked to the SRO and he said, do not have your students investigating an active case, which, was sound advice. I was always felt like I was right on the verge of getting fired as a teacher because I just pushed the envelope a lot. And so they looked into a notorious 1977 cold case in Oklahoma. And lo and behold, I just posted on social media, and all of this new evidence started coming in from the community, but also from outside of the community. And I feel like part of the reason is because um, there was this understanding that if you brought new information to the authorities, nothing would be done about it. And then McGirt got handed down, and all of a sudden, the Cherokee Nation had jurisdiction over its own land, as it had been for for 100 years, but it just hadn't been the law. The law had been broken, and I want to emphasize that to people who are really upset with McGirt. You have to understand this has been an instance of the law being broken for a very, very long time, and you can't fix that overnight. So it's going to take some time, and it's going to take adults who can have civil discussions sitting down to make to figure out how to implement this. But the ruling is right. And so as a result of that ruling, this notorious cold case has been reopened. And all of a sudden, this production company came to ask if they could make a TV series out of my third book, the true crime book. And I said, yeah, but there's also this other weird thing going on, and I'm not sure what to do with it. And so we ended up making a TV series out of that. And then, and so my students are in the TV series. And so the craziest part about about the story, I think, is that in my mind, when I left, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to write while I taught. There's no way you can teach and write books. At least I couldn't. I thought I was going to, ruin my career by going to teach, when in fact, these students and Stillwell, the community, actually launched my career far beyond my wildest dreams. If you would have told me 10 years ago when I was down at Holiday like trying to sell books out of a booth, that all this, in 2023, you're going to have not just a TV series, but you're going to be writing screenplays and you're going to be developing series. I probably would have smacked you because that was far beyond my wildest dreams. But that is one of the really important lessons that I've been learning in my life, and I've learned it over and over again, is that when you think oh, I'm doing such a good, it's so nice of me to go help somebody. I thought I was going to help the students at Stillwell, and the fact is they blessed me far. I could never repay what the students have done for me. And so, in solidarity with the writers' strike, um, we don't have anything in production, but there are another podcast that my students researched and wrote was Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And so there is a lot of interest in developing a television series on that, but I am not interested in telling those stories unless I can bring resources to the families to actually to find our people and bring them back home. And in Stillwell, we have quite a few instances of missing and murdered Indigenous people. So that's another thing that I'm very passionate about. And I still intend to get back to fiction someday. Someday, maybe I'll actually make my dream come true. But in the meantime, there was a much greater plan for me and Okie Noir and my writing than I ever could have imagined. And it all is due to the Cherokee Nation. I really believe that the Cherokee people and the Cherokee Nation inform me creatively. I can't stop writing about this place because I love it so much and because I'm so connected. And so I'm just in debt to all of you. I can't see who's in the crowd, but it warms my heart that you would show up, especially after I got a bit under the weather. And I thank you, Roy. I forgot one more thing. We wrote a book about our experience at Stillwell High School, and Roy Boney did the cover. Can you believe that? So that's another plug for Roy and me. But we're really proud of this, and this is a compilation of our experience of the students beginning to learn to tell their own stories and to realize that as a coalition they really can change the world, and also the experience of what it was like for them to go through COVID and to come out on the other side, and what the effect that had on them in the community. So I think that pretty much does it, but it's a pretty crazy story. Oh, one last thing, I was telling you about Beyond the Trail Cultural District. We are having our second annual Indigenous Day celebration on Saturday, I think it's October 6th. And it's gonna be at the stickball field at Carson Field in Stillwell. And yeah, I'm sorry, it's Saturday, October 7th from 5 to 8. Once again, we're gonna have music and performances and Cherokee National Treasures and art, and we're just gonna celebrate. So come out and celebrate with us. And I went barefoot last year and I got in trouble from the chief. So this year I promise I won't have my goat's hooves out for everybody to see. But come out and celebrate with us. We'll be really happy to see you. Sure. But I'm so sorry I didn't show up. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. That, That's actually one of my dreams, is to have a Cherokee writer's room. And yes, count me in. Thank you, but I'm honored. Thank you. I know he's always happy, isn't he? He just brightens the room. Oh, thank you guys so much. And everybody be safe out there. Don't let this bug get you down. Don't go hunty.